Good morning, folks, and welcome to SciChat Saturday, where we have fun having informal conversations about many science topics of the day, and of course, higher ed and academia getting wrapped into that. You can see I am not alone again today. We have another guest. I've been excited to have this gentleman on. He is Lee Jussim. Am I saying that right? Or
yeah, absolutely. That's right. Completely phonetic. American English phonetic. Yep.
So he is the founder of Unsafe Science on Substack, but he's also a social psychologist at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, where he was the department chair twice over, most recently from 2018 to 2022. I'm curious how the heck you ended up as the department acting chair for the anthropology department. I just saw that.
Yeah,
I don't know how that happened.
the ironies of that are cosmic, right? They're like beyond vast. And probably it would behoove me to be discreet about how I talk about it.
Okay, well, I can understand that. Let's see. He's published or edited 6 academic books and over 100 articles, numerous awards for scholarship. Until about a year ago, he also wrote for Psychology Today, Quillette, Arrow Magazine, Aeon, and more. In response to the rising ideological orthodoxy-induced censoriousness, which is a mouthful to say in and of itself, within institutions that are supposedly committed to truth-seeking. I'm also one of the founding members of the Academic Freedom Alliance and the New Society for Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences, where he is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences. His own research addresses stereotypes and prejudice, political radicalization, and reform of and dysfunctions within the social sciences. He tweets under the name of Dark Pirate Jussim, or I think it's Dark Fiddling Pirate now, routinely addressing issues of free and open inquiry, good and bad social science, and occasionally getting into arguments with his colleagues rather. Yeah, I gotta ask, because I hadn't heard the story of where the Dark Fiddling Pirate came from. That's that.
Oh, really?
No, I hadn't heard that. I hadn't read all the way through it. I started reading through the thread earlier, but I figured I was going to have you on. I could ask that question. She's like, "Where?
Oh, yeah.
Why the Dark Pirate or the Dark Fiddling Pirate now?"
Yeah. All right. Okay. So it really started with the pirate, and I don't know, about 2 or 3 years ago. Let me see. I want to actually show you this. So I'm going to call this up while I talk. I got some Twitter, it wasn't even like an argument. Like it was, I've gotten into Twitter arguments with people, but this didn't even rise to my level of what I think of as an argument. I think, I forget the exact, I actually have a Twitter thread on this, which I'm not going to track down. But I tweeted, oh, here we go. So I'm going to share this. My response. So how do I present?
Yeah, where it says present, and then you have options
share
for sharing.
Screen.
Yeah.
And I want to share screen. No, I don't want to share any of that.
There should be an option to share window tab or browser tab if you have it.
It is, let's try window. Oh, there we go. Okay. And I hit share. So you see this? No, you cannot see it yet. What? So I think I should, maybe I shared the wrong thing.
No, I think it's just being a slow load, unfortunately.
All right, so I can just describe it. I've been using Bitmojis for a year. Bitmojis are like scaled up emojis.
I think I have it actually. I can pull it up myself. Let me see from your tweet thread.
I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to try it once more, and then I'm going to surrender. Like the only thing is, this thing is so innocent that it's like completely ridiculous. It's a Bitmoji, so it's a cartoon figure of me dressed up as a pirate. I'm going to try once more. I'm going to share that. Okay.
And maybe a combination of internet connections.
Yeah, all right. It's a cartoon figure of me as a pirate, unsheathing a sword across my face, right? And it was, I don't know, I think it was like someone else was in the discussion, and I thought they made a really good point, and we were not, again, it was a disagreement, but it wasn't really an argument. I thought they made a killer point, so I just did this. Okay. The next thing I know, I'm suspended from Twitter.
Yeah, for that emoji character.
For the emoji. Yes, it was for the emoji, and I protested it. Actually someone once put me in contact with what was then, kind of, it was what's his name? Jack Dorsey, but it was like the people kind of not too far below him. And I said, this is ridiculous. Like, what the hell is going on here?
Well,
And
this was the one that got you in trouble, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So that got me unsuspended. But I thought the whole thing was ridiculous that I started tweeting as the Dread Pirate Jussim, kind of the
Yeah,
what's
I saw that. Yeah.
The sword and sorcery fancy, the Princess Bride, right? There was the Dread Pirate Roberts. So I like, I really kind of like this sort of Dread Pirate Jussim thing. So I did that for a while. And then one of my followers described me as like the Dark Knight of psychology. And I really kind of like that. Right. So then I changed it to, and the Dread Pirate was so derivative. So I started just tweeting as the Dark Pirate Justin. And part of it is I really love that, given all the like crazy culture wars over race and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
From like May through October, I am physically darker than my Cuban and Mexican relatives. So my kids are married into Cuban and Mexican families, and I'm just like darker than all of them. And I drive these old crappy cars. And except when I have like an official like academic meeting, I mean, I put on this shirt so that I would look, kind of semi respectable for this thing. But I'm usually like in the summer, I'll be in some like raggy sleeveless shirt, and stuff. Okay. So that's how I, wander around most of the time. And often, if I'm driving, I'll be on my way to or from tennis or errands or something like that. And so I'll be driving these old crappy cars in these old crappy clothes, and I'm like darker than most Mexicans and Cubans, and probably darker than a quarter. The big East Indian population here, probably darker than about a quarter of them. Okay, I never have any trouble with police. Like I have trouble with the police when I do something illegal, like speed 20 miles over the limit. That's when I have trouble with the police. But other than that, I don't have to. Now I'm not denying that other people do. I'm not saying there aren't issues. I'm just describing my personal experience. So anyway,
we'll emphasize that, just describing his own experience here.
Yeah, I'm just describing my own experience. Exactly. So that was kind of in the mix also. And then the fiddling entered when I was denounced by 1,400 academics for using a metaphor based on Fiddler on the Roof. So that whole story. You were one of the people who stepped up and kind of defended me in the midst of all of it, which I am deeply grateful for. It was one of the most ridiculous things, which I am now making hay with. I have a book chapter that goes into it that kind of appropriately characterizes it as this sort of Maoist event that it was. I mean, really, I doubt that many of the denouncers are card-carrying Maoists, but the behavior of that mob was very Mao-esque in its in how it worked. So I have a paper coming out that sort of goes into that. So I've totally been able to sort of run with this, and I'm studying radicalization now, and there I am in the midst of it. But anyway, there are lots of different ways to respond and to even get revenge for something like this. But one of the sweetest is to embrace that which they denounced you for. So it was, immediately after that, I became the dark fiddling pirate Jussim.
I did see that. I saw the handle change when all that started.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was ridiculous. I think you called it first, and I just embraced the name. It was the whole Fiedler on the Roof fiasco for unfortunately Klaus Fiedler, who lost his editorial position over the whole thing. Right. But it's like, which was ridiculous, and it was a classic case of what happens with activism in academia. And actually, I mean, that's part of the reason you came to mind is I think let me see if I can't share this real quick. Yes, I know sharing is easier with two monitors, but for example, it's been pretty clear in the last few years, like you can see it from Twitter things and what have you, that there's so many scholars who are now listing themselves as scholar activists, which to me would seem like an oxymoron, because you're like, if you're a scholar, you're hopefully after the truth, but if you're an activist, you're kind of not. So
Yeah.
it's one of those things. So, like, just a Twitter search on scholar activist, how many different things do you come up with?
Well, do you know who Sarah Hayter is?
I do not.
Okay, so Sarah Hayter is a kind of a public intellectual, and she is the founder, and I believe still president of Ex-Muslims of America. And this is like this is a big thing within the Muslim community, because in certain very traditional versions of Islam, you're an apostate if you leave the faith. You are subject to all sorts of terrible punishments and ostracism, which she experienced actually when she left the faith. And she founded, but she's an American, so she's like, this is the United States of America. I do whatever the hell I want here. But then there's the community response to it, and she's just brilliant. And she has a Substack. She's been writing essays and all sorts of appearances, like podcasts, and she's just I don't think she has like 100,000 Twitter followers or something like that, and she's just very, very good. She is, in my opinion, sharper and more insightful as a cultural, personal, psychological, and political commentator than almost all of my academic colleagues. And I don't think she has a PhD or anything. She's just brilliant. She's really, really brilliant. And one of her essays is on how you can either seek truth or activism. And she wasn't condemning. She said, you need, to make such changes. Sometimes you need to make changes. There's some injustice or just things aren't working well. It's not ridiculous for people to embrace activism from time to time, but that activism and truth are in conflict. And that if you're doing one, you pretty much can't do the other. You can pretend to do the other, but you really can't do the other. And it's just a brilliant essay. Because she's brilliant, she articulated it way better than I am doing it here. And I just really recommend it. I don't remember what she calls her Substack, but anyone who's listening is interested, if you just Google search Sarah Hayter Substack, her Substack will come right up. Then you got to look for this article.
Yeah, I what you're saying reminds me of Jonathan Haidt did a similar article actually for Heterodox Academy, where it was basically just, you can only pick one telos, really. You got to pick either truth or social justice, but we seem to be trying to marry the two, which I don't think is going to end well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems you have is activists think they're acting on the truth, and actually, there are times when, if you really know something to be true, the activism and truth seeking can be synergistic. So consider just something purely scientific. So you think that humans should reach to the stars, right? Okay, well, first you need the science that will provide the technology that would lead to inventions that would allow us to reach the stars. And then like the first step was going to the moon, and maybe the next step is going to Mars, right? But once that's available, to then advocate that we should do it is not ridiculous, right? And it is not compromising truth. So you could do that with illness, whether it's the COVID vaccine or, in third world countries that, in the worst of the impoverished conditions, they're often unsanitary, and there are like not really that expensive ways to clean things up and improve people's health. So those kinds of activism that are really based on clear, sound science, like objective science, are not ridiculous and not compromising science I don't think in any way. But the problem comes in when people erroneously believe they are acting on science that is really dubious, or just pretending, exploiting science for political activist purposes. We have that all the time.
Oh yeah. No, I understand that. I'm I'm not a social scientist. I'm in the climate science realm myself. So it's certainly been interesting in the last few years to see a lot of the activists who exploit some of the things going on in my own field. So yeah, I get that sentiment very much so. But I also I tend to agree, although with a bit of a caveat in the notion that, like, yes, if you're doing science and helping to fix a problem in society or something along that line, you can do that bit of activism and not be compromising things. But it also, at the same time, potentially opens the door to compromising things at the same time. So it's, I
Right.
guess a good follow-on question for that is, like, if you want to do that, how do you do it in such a manner that you don't inadvertently end up compromising your ideals and becoming more interested in social activism than, say, you do your research and you find, oh, well, this isn't fulfilling a narrative that I really like. Well, if you're the scholar who's dedicated to truth seeking, you would go with that thing in your research, even though it's probably not going to earn you a whole lot of friends.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so that's, you have all these social processes wrapped up into this, when, I mean, this is putting the final touches on a chapter on academic tribalism. That's where, sort of my uh, characterization of the perspectives mob as really, classic authoritarianism sort of comes in. And so there is that risk. There absolutely is that risk. I mean, so I'm not going to go down that road yet, although I'm happy to. Your question was, how do you avoid doing it? And I believe, I don't know that there's a single answer, but one answer is to really understand how uncertain most new science and especially social science is. This was the recent time, and I recently gave a talk on academic misinformation. And sort of the centerpiece of that were 4 points. The sort of the general point was that there are lots of general reasons, general scientific reasons not to treat the peer-reviewed academic literature as establishing scientific facts. And you'll be on, if you can wrap your brain around this, it'll be, if what you're interested in is doing scientifically justified activism, and you first wrap your brain around this, you'll be in a much better position because you won't be leaping to conclusions that are not justified and then wreaking all sorts of damage based on things you believe to be true that are not actually true. So that's the, so let me just, I'll go through there are more than these, but this is the talk that I just gave. So there's the replication crisis, right? At least in psychology and beyond, biomed and psychology, the run rate of pre-registered replication success is about 50%. Yeah, it's a little more, a little less. It's not completely clear what to make of that, but the run rate for now is about 50%. Now, that's high enough. I mean, if it was all nonsense, it would be 5%. So, there's somebody's discovering something, but it's very hard to know which is which, at least on initial publication. So, there is this sort of, I think, many academic social scientists act as if that they can, treat, if something was published, it's a scientific fact. And it's just, the fact that it was published is a fact, but its claims, conclusions, or results are not facts. They're, it may be facts that they founded, assume there was no funny business, but it's just not. You need years to figure out whether the main finding was true. It needs to be replicated by independent labs. People need to criticize the interpretation. I mean, there's just like all sorts of ways in which just because something was published, it does not necessarily mean now we all have to accept that a new fact was discovered.
Yeah, it's a provisional thing until you get more replication.
And I would not give it very much weight. I would give it almost no weight on the basis of, one lab produces a 3-study paper. It's like, okay, well, this is kind of interesting. Maybe they found something. I'm glad they got this thing published. Maybe the person will now get tenure and maybe they'll now get a $500,000 grant and become famous. But no one has there's no impetus on anybody to believe that anything they found is true because one lab produces a 3-study paper. Like, you can believe it if you want, but none of the rest of us need to believe it. That's insufficient evidence to believe anything. It doesn't mean they're wrong. I'm just saying I don't have to believe it. So, okay. So that's the replication process. Then you have allegiance bias.
I was going to say, if you like, I have your slides. I can pull them up if you like.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's necessary. I mean, you're welcome to. Feel free. So, there's allegiance bias, which, and now this doesn't always happen, but it does sometimes happen, that if a person is steeped in and sort of an advocate of a certain kind of theory or intervention, this was first discovered in clinical psychology. So if you're a cognitive behavioral, somebody might be a cognitive behavioral therapist. What allegiance bias is the tendency for people who believe in some theory or intervention to find stronger effects of that, manipulations designed from that theory or interventions based on that theory. They find bigger effects than do pretty much everybody else. Again, this doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes there are no allegiance bias effects in certain literatures, but sometimes they do occur. And so the great message is, just because the peer-reviewed literature says something doesn't mean it's true, especially if it's published by an advocate. And the most recent version of this was there's this just brilliant debunking of growth mindset interventions. And the whole thing is just everyone, if you want to learn how to do rigorous scientific skepticism, that article, it's interesting as growth mindset, but to me, it's even more interesting as this is how you do scientific skepticism.
Mm-hmm. So, and this is actually a real good point to make a point, because one of my concerns with like activism and academia and what have you is the fact that, yes, over the last few years in particular, the trust in academia and the trust in scientists writ large, not just social scientists, has gone down. It's in a number of different things, which is a concern. But the reason I bring it up is that the trust in academia in peer review, which sometimes is not worth it, it does drive other things. And the reason I mention that is because the growth mindset intervention thing has become really prominent in social emotional learning as implemented in K through 12 schools. So
right.
Another good friend of the channel, Deb Philman, who runs The Reason We Learn, has talked about this in depth about how much of a problem it's been. But things like this need to get out there just as much, and yet it doesn't necessarily.
Well, right. Yeah. So I'm just going to read this stuff highlighted. I don't know if people can see it. And it's like a pleasure to read. We found major shortcomings in study design, analysis, and reporting, and suggestions of researcher and publication bias. Authors with a financial incentive to report positive findings published significantly larger effects than authors without this incentive. Across all studies, we observed a small overall effect, a non-zero effect, which was non-significant after correcting for potential publication bias. Exactly. That is, it's not clear there's anything here at all, and no one has any need to believe that the hundreds of papers on growth mindset have produced anything of value. Now, maybe they have, and maybe 10 or 20 years from now, someone will clean up all this stuff up and they'll do the manipulation in the right way, and it will have a substantial, maybe that's hypothetically impossible. This debunking doesn't rule that out as a possibility, but here now, after 20 years of this research and hundreds of studies, there is no reason for anyone to believe it.
Oh yeah. But of course, the sort of comeback is, and I think you got to this later in your slides and in other talks that you've given. Well, but there's all these studies, they made it through peer review. How could they all be wrong, right? But I go back. I think it was Einstein who said it at one point. It's just like, yeah, no amount of studies can prove me right, but one can prove me wrong.
Yeah.
Which I think this falls into that category.
Yeah, well, it is a little different in social science. So let's say we can go with growth mindset. Again, at this point, I think it's all hot air at this point. But I could be wrong about that. Maybe there is some way in which it actually matters. But so let's take the counterfactual that it does matter if it's done right, and it's a small to modest effect. Maybe there are conditions under which it's larger or zero, but the run rate is a small to moderate effect. If it's a small to moderate effect on a study by study basis, you can have lots of studies not finding it, and it still be a real effect. So let's say there were 100 good, high quality studies that even McNamara and Burgoyne would agree, wow, these are high quality. They didn't find 100 high quality, they found 0 high quality studies. But let's say there were 100 that would meet their standards for high quality. Okay. If there's no there, all else equal, you would expect 5 out of 100 to be significant.
Right.
Let's say 25 out of 100 are significant, and they're done well. Well, that's way more than you would expect if there was no there, even though 3/4 don't find anything at all. So that's Einstein may be right with respect to physics, but it's not, that doesn't hold with respect to social science.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. Boy, I appreciate conversations like this. I am a physical scientist, not a social scientist.
Yeah. And I do think my field is filled with lots of nonsense. And, that's usually, people will hear me say that. I write about it and all that kind of stuff. However, this other side that really you can actually have lots of failed replications and the phenomena still be true, you usually hear that from people engaging in apologetics for the field, sort of defensively defending the field, but there's a way in which it is actually literally and scientifically true.
Okay, that makes sense. And for our audience, feel free to ask away questions in the chat if you have them. If they come to mind, we will bring them up. But yeah, so you have allegiance bias, you have replication bias, and then we can...
Oh, yeah. Well, so a bunch of us, there's so many ironies here also, but a bunch of us just had a paper published in eLife on communication devices. So these are sort of rhetorical tactics that researchers use when they write their papers or maybe give talks that either make the work seem more impressive or more important than it really deserves. They make it seem more certain than it really deserves. It justifies it implicitly presumes certain inferences are justified when in fact they're not justified. And these tactics can be used to sort of gloss over or sweep under the rug flaws or limitations that would justifiably increase the dubiousness or the skepticism with which people understand the work. And this paper listed a whole bunch of these. And this is one of one of the slides goes through a handful of those. And we could have called, and it was broken up into different types of these rhetorical tactics. And we didn't call one of them misinformation. We called it mischaracterizing the state of the art, the modern, whatever the work is in that area. But mischaracterizing and is basically synonymous in this context. So, I'm going to go through a couple that I talked about in this talk, but there were like over 20 in this paper. And the paper was, in order to publish in eLife, which is who published it, they wanted a very short, tight paper. So that's about half the number that we had an early draft of about 40 of these things. Oh, and even that was probably less than there might have been. But anyway, so this is a handful of the 22 that made it into the paper. So there's one-sided citation. One-sided citation is, let's say there's some controversy in the literature, like a very real live controversy is how much sexist bias is there in peer review? That is peer review biased against women? Unbiased? Is it biased against, biased in favor of women, against men? And there's evidence all over the place. It's like you can find studies showing all of them. Now, I'm not going to, this podcast is not, I don't think it's useful. I don't think we could resolve what the answer is, and the answer might be different in different contexts. But what you can't do is cite only the studies showing a conventional sexist bias and then conclude, look how much peer review is relentlessly biased against women without acknowledging the existence of the other studies showing either no bias or anti-male bias. That you can do it. People do it all the time. That is a form of academic misinformation. So anyway, so that's one type of these persuasive communication devices. There's relying on weak evidence. If you want to write an article, an academic article about, the importance of growth mindset, You still could. Just because there's this one paper saying there's no there, you could just cite the other 400 papers that, quote, find, unquote, growth mindset effects. And it would look like a conventional academic paper. You would have technical terms, and you would have statistics, and you would have citations, and it would have all the appearances of a scientific paper, but it's relying on an entire body of literature that no one has any reason to believe. So it's just there's a slew of these techniques, and we kind of unpack them.
Out of my curiosity, what were some of the techniques that didn't get into the paper?
Oh, well, so that's actually one of the things I talked about here in this talk is propaganda scholarship. So what propaganda scholarship, this almost goes right into your main theme that that you invited me on to talk about, was sort of activism masquerading as truth-seeking or science, or as corrupting science. And years ago, I discovered this great series of papers by Eileen Gambrill. And I never met her. I never saw her give a talk. I only know these papers. I think she's now retired. I'm not really sure. She was actually a professor of social work. And I don't think when she was writing about propaganda, it does not look to me like what she had in mind was political propaganda in the liberal conservative or communist fascist sense. It was really an academic propaganda, promoting a way of, she was probably mostly thinking about a way of doing social work. You can see the second title there is Evidence-Informed Practice, Antidote to Propaganda in the Helping Professions. So that's what she was doing. But as part of doing it, on the next slide, there's a screenshot of her checklist of things you can do to evaluate whether a paper, how much it's infected by propaganda. And this is stuff that's just brilliant. It's just absolutely brilliant. It's so simple, it's so straightforward, and it's just so on target. So,
okay, I was wondering what that was, because you do the same thing that I do when I'm prepping presentations. I'll have an image up there, but no it's there. But
right. So she sort of like our persuasive communications thing, and this is one of the things that I wanted to get in there. We agreed to cut it because we had to cut something, and this was somewhat partially overlapped, as you'll see, with some of the stuff that was already there. So that was fine. But so the first bold heading on the very top is the nature of the problem addressed. And she's probably talking about mental health issues, is in dispute, yes or no. So, if it's not in dispute, then fine, we're good. There's not really much of a potential for propaganda. Is suicide a problem? Well, no, who's going to say that suicide is not a serious problem? Okay. So, but on the other hand, if the problem is in dispute, to take a live modern issue, how much is adolescent transgender identification genuinely identifying with a different sex than one was born with, then reflecting some other underlying psychological distress that is being misinterpreted by the person as a transgender type identity. So that would be very controversial. And there's really, as far as I can tell, there's evidence on both sides of that. It may not be equal evidence. I'm not doing an evaluation of that evidence, and I'm making no claim about frequencies. I'm just saying the nature of the problem there would be in dispute. So you would have to, if you're going to do it honestly, you would check yes. And then and now that's not propaganda per se, that's just your starting point. Then the next questions are, only one view of the problem is presented. If your answer to that is yes, it's beginning to look like a propaganda piece. The view is presented as established. Well, if it's controversial, it's probably not established, right? So, and it just goes on and on with questions that help a reader evaluate whether, or the extent to which, a given academic article is infused with propaganda. And it's just brilliant. It's just brilliant. And so then I walk through, in the same talk, I walk through the grievance studies sting, where Lindsay and Bogosian and Pluckrose got all these like bizarre claims published in the peer-reviewed literature. And then when you put up some of the claims, to overcome patriarchy, we should leash men like dogs. White students should be chained to desks and floors to experience oppression. My favorite, which was controversial when it first came out, was their rewrite of Mein Kampf. And, like some of the pushback on that as well, you can't really recognize Mein Kampf in it, but you actually can if you read it closely enough. Some of the paragraphs are like, really, it's like really, really obvious that it is. And then it's like, oh, well, those weren't really that bad. So it's like, you can really, that is going to be your defense. That it's like, that Hitler's Mein Kampf is really just not that bad. Okay, whatever. So, they got all this stuff
into an article. I mean, that should be bad, but
I know, right? And then, I walked through this paper published just a couple of years ago. I thought this was a hoax paper.
I thought it was a hoax too when I saw that. That was horrific.
So I'm going to read it in case, I don't know who's listening and if they can't see it. The highlighted quote from the abstract: parasitic whiteness renders its host's appetites voracious, insatiable, and perverse. These deformed appetites particularly target non-white peoples. Once established, these appetites are nearly impossible to eliminate. Okay, so this is just really virulent stuff. There is a sort of epilogue here, which probably most people don't know. You could say, well, weird stuff gets published in the peer-reviewed literature. This is like some psychoanalytic journal, blah, 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 blah. This thing won an award for the best, or for an honorary anti-racist award from the association. So it's not just like this guy got something through a couple of reviewers and an editor. It was like this, the luminaries of the society deemed this so good that it deserved a special award for anti-racism. Okay, so when the paper came out, I'm just like shaking my head. Like, I can't believe this is what even sections of academia have come to. I can't believe people don't see this for what it is. And it kind of molds there and kind of emerges back to thinking about it here and there. And then it hits me like 2 or 3 months after the paper came out. It hit me that this was familiar, that it wasn't just this demonization rhetoric. It was, and I was like, where the hell would I have seen something like this before? And then it hit me. It was the actual Mein Kampf.
Yeah.
And so, Mein Kampf is a very long book, but I have a PDF version of it. So I just did a Control F for Parasite. I just did it, and he refers to parasitic influences intermittently throughout the book, but there aren't that many. That allowed me to really hone in. And there's this great quote. It's this horrible quote from Hitler.
It's horrible.
Like, oh my God, the parallels between this thing are just stark. They're completely stark.
And I guess that raises a good question with the activism in academia, because you were saying that, like, how do people not see this? Well, that is the question. How do people not see this? And I know I put this to Anna and to a few others, that my contention with that is that, particularly my generation and younger, we're just not teaching about some of these things anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. A couple of years ago, when I was just really beginning to gear up my stuff on radicalization, I asked the undergrads in my lab if they knew anything about the Cold War and Soviet communism.
Mm.
And it was all blank looks. It was blank looks. And, these were smart and motivated undergraduates. Most of them were either juniors or seniors. So they're like 21, 22. It's not like these are, green 17-year-olds. Although they don't learn about this in high school. It's ridiculous also. But they had no idea. So they had no idea about the abuses under communism, whether, really everywhere it came to power. They don't really know anything about it. They don't know about the mass murder. They don't know about, this sort of authoritarian censorship, the imperialism. They don't know anything, they don't know anything about it. And so,
well, even some of the soft censorship, and I'm since Kieran's here, I'm going to borrow the example that happened with him because he's a photojournalist by training, but of course, when the pandemic happened, he couldn't go out and about and do his work. So he went back to university and was involved in doing a project, and I forget the exact nature of the project, but resulted on a pylon on him at the university. Is like the university shouldn't be granting this racist journalist, I believe at the time, a degree because of what he was trying to do in his final project. Now he fought and won and graduated with honors. And so,
congratulations, good for you.
But during the course of that, he also had the other kind of soft censorship where I think it was the department head in the psychology department over there that referred to him as being mentally deficient because he was challenging a bunch of this stuff.
Oh my God.
So it's something very, that's the kind of, when I mentioned that to Anna in an interview, she actually reminded me and pointed out that this was the same kind of soft censorship that the Soviets would do, and that they diagnosed people with sluggish schizophrenia if you dissented. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you. Yes, this was the
So
this was the project in question that got him in trouble.
I have some personal experience along these lines. So over the last like 5 to 10 years, in a variety of different ways, I have gotten to know people who immigrated here to the US from either former Soviet, either from the former Soviet Union or behind the Iron Curtain, or from China. And I know them in very different ways. So Anna is one; she's from the former Soviet Union. But I have a couple of colleagues her and one or two others who I work with, collaborate with, who are also from behind the Iron Curtain. One actually escaped from Hungary in the trunk of a car in the 1980s. And in addition to that, I have quite a number of acquaintances, mainly, though not exclusively, tennis buddies. People I regularly play tennis with, but I'm not really like friends with outside of tennis much. And after we play a couple of sets, we hang around, we bullshit for a little bit. And usually we bullshit about tennis or, how you doing? How's the family? Blah, 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 right? But once in a while we talk politics. And everyone, this is like, I don't know, maybe the total number of people is in the double digits. I mean, including my colleagues and collaborators and these acquaintances. I mean, one of the three students in my lab now, her parents were immigrants from the Soviet Union. Every one of them, to a person, if we have this discussion, say their version of, I came here to get away from all that, and I can't believe it's here. Every one of them, separate conversations. They don't know each other. It's like a tennis player versus a chemistry professor. A tennis player in New Jersey and there's a chemistry professor in California. There's no conversations except via me going on. So
well, yeah, no. And I as I said to Anna, I didn't come here from the Soviet Union, but my grandparents did actually. They fled the Soviet Union. Yeah, they fled the Soviet Union in the 40s. And my grandmother in particular, like my great grandfather and her first husband were both murdered by the Soviets. So she fled with my infant aunt at the time in arms and made it to a displaced persons camp in Germany, where she ultimately met and married my grandfather, who was also Estonian. And he had the other problem because Stalin during World War II was not great about defending Estonia and other things and other places. And so he was, my grandfather was in a farm family in Estonia. And he came home from the market one day and found his whole family had been murdered by a Nazi raiding party. And so in cruel twist of fate, of course, he couldn't take care of a whole farm by himself. He was like 18 at the time. There's no way he could do it. So he ended up drafted in the Nazi military by no choice of his own, really. He didn't want it. He never saw combat, never fought in combat, but he loved motorcycles till the day he died because how he finally escaped from that whole situation was they needed motorcycle officers. And so he decided, you know what, I'm going to take the training for how to ride a motorcycle because he'd never ridden a motorcycle before. And then he, as soon as he had enough training, he stole the motorcycle and left.
Sophia, okay, if you ever want to just write up that personal part of the history, I'd post it on my Substack in a minute. I would love a story like that. So
I would have some.
uh-oh. Ah.
Just happened.
Yeah, we froze. I'm not sure. I started opening other windows to see if my Wi-Fi was working, and it was. But other
I
than that,
know it was on my end. The connection
Yeah.
went haywire for a second. Sorry about that, folks.
yeah.
I don't know where
But
I got
send
stuck.
me an invitation. I would that slice of historical life. It is. There's no time frame because the
We're back,
story.
Karen. We're back.
Yeah. I just saw your comment, Karen.
But that's yeah. Yeah, no, I would just ask my family first if they're okay with me doing
Of course.
that. But yeah, that's a story I've told a few times since I learned about it from my mother. So it's probably the funniest part is we don't actually know if my grandparents were married when we got to asking them that question because they were married in that displaced persons camp. We don't know if they were actually married.
Right.
Formally, so
Yes, that'd be another nice, interesting little twist on the story. This would be such a great story to have a record of. I wish I never had conversations like this with my grandparents, and now I really regret it. I wish I would have. So.
Yeah, I didn't learn much about that from my grandparents directly, but my mother made sure to get a lot from them because they were, even when they moved to the US, they were extremely cagey about talking about it because there was a point for a while where you had KGB agents going around and things like that. So they were nervous about any kind of thing in the late 80s before the Soviet Union collapsed and like that. So they were really, really nervous about actually saying anything. And hence the reason why censorship is bad.
Oh my God. Yeah, I mean, again, this should be so obvious, and yet I don't know. Maybe because I'm steeped in it, it's like really obvious to me. But and maybe it's not. This actually gets to the last piece of the presentation was kind of on censorship. It was on how social pressure to not make a point, and that's up to and including political pressure and censorship, can distort an entire scientific literature. And there's that. This is based on Hrishikesh Joshi's Philosophy of Science article, the epistemic significance of social pressure. We go to the next slide. The next slide kind of displays what he's talking. He actually created this slide, so I used it in my talk. We actually have a paper we're collaborating in together. But what you can see there is, and what's shown there is the small circle is emblematic of the peer-reviewed literature under social pressure not to make a point. So the green stars are like something is true. The red stars are that it's not true. The peer review, if you look just at the peer reviewed literature, looks like it's pretty much true. There's like one inconsistent thing, but it's really pretty mostly true. The wider circle is the evidence writ large in the real world. It's the full universe of evidence that bears on this question. And if you look there, there's lots of red stars. There's lots of evidence saying that this thing is not true, but it doesn't get into the peer-reviewed literature because there's social pressure against making that claim. And so people are afraid to make it. They self-censor. If it does make it into the literature, you can get, you can incite the mob. Maybe the paper gets retracted. And so social pressure up to and including censorship can, and I think has, completely distorted certain literatures on certain academic literatures on certain topics. And so the great message of that is not merely that you can't believe any single study. If there's social political pressure not to make a claim, you can't believe the entire literature. There could be 500 articles saying something, but if people are afraid and therefore unwilling to contest the thing 500 articles say, the 500 articles may be nonsense.
Well, yeah, and you would hope that the editors of different journals would allow for dissenting views. I mean, we saw that recently with Ken Zucker, unfortunately, with one of the ROGD papers. It's a Suzanne Diaz and Bailey. That particular paper is a prime example of how activists got riled up over something.
Right,
It's just like that was such a weird technicality. I mean, do we have to ask everybody now with like IRBs if they want to be published in a journal?
Yeah, so I don't know enough of the history. So I did a Substack on this, and it has what the hell is the title? It has some like weird title, the absurd but possibly legitimate Diaz and Bailey retraction. So it's absurd because the idea that you need to ask people for permission to publish in a peer-reviewed journal is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. It's like they know that's what science is. It's about communicating stuff. So you don't need the idea that there's a general ethical principle that you need to ask that permission, I think is ridiculous. That's what makes it absurd. There may be exceptions. So let's say I'm doing a very small scale ethnographic study and there's 4 or 5 people. Even if I write it up, even without revealing their names, there may be so much personal information there that other people may recognize who it is from the write-up. Right. In that situation, it's reasonable to ask for permission to publish in a peer-reviewed journal.
Sure.
But that's not what Diaz and Bailey did. They administered a survey to, 1,500 people or something like that.
It's incredibly anonymous from the looks of it.
It's an anonymous survey. There's no way identifying information was even on the table of being revealed. So it's a complete non-issue. So it's absurd. However, what makes it possibly legitimate is that the journal really had this rule on the books that, it's not like they just invented it to retract the paper, like post hoc. A priori, I went onto the Wayback Machine and looked for the journal's publication requirements going back 2 or 3 years. And 2 or 3 years ago, right there in the requirements is you need to, one of the ethical things is for them was that you need to ask permission to publish in the peer-reviewed journal. Now, what makes it merely so if they have this rule and they've been applying it, then it may be silly, but it's legitimate in the sense of they're following their own internally consistent rules.
They're following their own rules at least, even if we don't like the rules.
If they were actually following their rules,
which is what you pointed out,
never having applied them to anyone until the Diaz and Bailey paper. And I didn't go back into their history to have an opinion on that. I strongly suspect that's what happened, that the rule is so, I suspect, I don't know this, I suspect the rule is so silly they never applied it to anyone prior to Diaz and Bailey, then it would not be legitimate, because you can't be in the business of having like a jaywalking law that you only apply to Black people or gay couples. You can't do it. That's completely illegitimate. The law can be on the books, but you cannot apply it in that way. In the same way, if the only time you apply that ethical principle is when there's a mob calling for retraction, that is also illegitimate. Yeah. But I don't know that for fact. Maybe they did apply it to other articles. I don't know.
I mean, it sounded like after the fact they were going to go back and apply it. Now that they've been called that they didn't.
Yeah, well, so and even that to me is ambiguous. They did say that. Are they actually doing it? I mean, maybe. I haven't heard anything. That would be a very convenient thing to say in order to calm down the criticism and then just go back to business as usual. But I don't know that they're doing that. I haven't followed it or dived into it to know. So.
I haven't done too much. I've been meaning to take a look at the whole long history of it. But for those who are wondering, the paper we're referring to is on rapid onset gender dysphoria by Suzanne Diaz and Michael Bailey, and was subject of all sorts of criticism because it challenges some preeminent narratives, if you will. And has
Well,
to
I
do
mean,
with
it has some
surveying
pretty
parents,
major.
not surveying kids as much.
It has some important methodological limitations, but they acknowledge them in the paper, which is like how social science is normally conducted. But that's how good social science is conducted. You do a study, all studies are flawed and have limitations. You, as much as you can, you acknowledge them when you discuss what to make of it. And then, if it gets accepted, it's accepted. That should be the end of the story.
You're reminding me of another paper that should have been retracted, but the journal decided to defend it anyway. And that was the, oh goodness, the physical sciences education journal from the American Physical Society that published the godforsaken article on observing whiteness in introductory physics.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Which
That
was
was just,
roundly mocked.
oh my God. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, it's in the spirit of the On Having Whiteness Journal of Psychoanalytics. It's like you can promote this nonsense in major journals now, and that I genuinely don't understand why this stuff is taken seriously. I really don't. It's like there's a vulnerability on the part of, I would guess, mostly progressive academics. That if you can say almost anything in the name of anti-racism, no matter how bizarre, but if you frame it as anti-racism, then, like the progressive guilt and shame over historical racism kicks in, and now it's like, oh yeah, this is a great article. Oh yeah, parasitic whiteness. Yeah, whiteness in physics. Yeah. Oh yeah, this is the kind of scholarship we need.
Oh, Anna sent me another one that I actually will review at some point, in which they're trying to equate the concept of equity with the physics concept of energy at the same time. It's like, I don't know exactly how I'm going to review it, but I'm just like, that one has to get reviewed, if only just to say, it's like, that makes absolutely no sense what you're trying to do.
Oh my God.
But
yeah.
I'm curious what you make of, because the social pressure is actually a good point to leap off of this. In the vein of activism in academia, I know one of the things that's been proposed recently is these ethics and society review boards to complement the institutional review boards. Whereas like the IRBs focus on the safety of participants and things like that in social studies, this is more so about putting out the guidelines if there's any potential harm, quote unquote, that could happen with with a group of people that is connected to those people. So like, say you do a survey on a whole group of one particular race or something like that. Well, how does it harm everybody who wasn't in the survey, and can we publish it if it's going to cause harm? Whatever the heck harm actually means.
Yeah. Well, so there was, do I have this handy? Jesse Singal, of all people, had a really good Substack on a journal's policy on harmful language. And I'd have to track it down, so I'm going to do my best to do it from memory. And Jesse's a pretty skeptical, critical guy. He's very good in my opinion. And he was lauding this article for doing a good job handling a potentially difficult topic. And I tracked down the journal, and I agree with him. I think he's right. The journal deserved to be lauded because they had 4 principles. I'm not sure if I remember all of them, but they go something like this. People have the right to be called what they want to be called. That's number 1, which I find really amusing because the last I looked, every national survey of people of Central and South American origin say they want to be, the vast majority say they want to be described as Hispanics. Vast majority. But in academia, unless you call them Latinx, you're at risk of being denounced for, wrong language. All right. So that principle, I think, is the absolutely right principle. But if you were to implement it, we would be referring to them as Hispanics. So I find that just really deliciously ironic. That was 1. Number 2, whether people want to be called something or not is an empirical question. So you're right. It's like, it's not just because you say so. You're right. Okay, so that was good. And then whether use of a particular term or type of language was harmful is also an empirical question. That is, to claim for the journal to take seriously a claim of harm in use of a particular language, you would actually have to present evidence of it causing harm. It's not harmful because someone thinks so. Again, this is like, okay, I can sign up for this. And if you actually had evidence of harm, I don't think there's any. I think even people who self-describe as free speech absolutists are not free speech absolutists. I don't think there is any such thing as a free speech absolutist. I come closer to that end than probably many academics, but there's no such thing, and that includes me. And in fact, if there was clear evidence that some sort of linguistic term caused harm, I probably would get on board with not using that term in a scientific journal. Like, you could come up with some other term. Why cause unnecessary harm if you don't have to? Okay, so there was that, and then the fourth one was something like, and again, I'm doing this from memory. You need to do honest history. So if they used some term that is now, verboten in 2023, but that's how people wrote and talked in 1933, that's the term you should use, especially if you're quoting them, because that, it would be historically inaccurate to quote them as using some term that they didn't use. So, and it's like, these are good principles. I'll sign up for these principles. This is absolutely right.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think I would agree for the most part, except for when it's applied in the physical science thing. And I know this was probably what got Anna started off in it. Like, you shouldn't refer to it as this because this person was X. I mean, well, wait a minute. If it's a physical thing that's named after a person, that's not really going to cause harm.
Yeah, right. Well,
so there's a little bit of a difference there. It's like, what do you mean by causing harm, right?
Right. Yeah. So there's harm. Then, okay, so let's say you retreat from the harm thing, because most of the harm claims are nonsense, in my opinion. Not all of them, but most of them are. But you can have other non-harm based reasons exactly for renaming things or taking statues down. I'm listening to this great podcast, which is like the antidote to the 1619 Project. It's called The History of the Americans. And the guy who is doing this podcast is committed to presenting to the best that he can. It's called The History of the Americans because it's about the history of the people within the boundaries of the current United States of America. Now, some of that history involves things that are international because that directly affected things that occurred in, the current boundaries of the United States of America. But he repeatedly says, I'm going to do my best to do this without presentism. That is, without imposing the morals and values of the present on events from 200 or 300 or 400 years ago. So he's just brilliant about that. But one of the things one of the podcasts in particular, he talks about the legacy of Columbus. It's a really mixed legacy because as an explorer, he was amazing. In some ways, he was really stupid, right? The reason nobody else wanted to fund a trip to China was people knew the world was about as big as it is and that there was no way he was going to get to China and it was going to be a disaster. He just lucked out that there was like a whole pair of
there's a whole landmass in the middle. Yeah.
A third of the way. It was not even halfway. It's like a third of the way to China. So, but anyway, but he was a very good navigator. And, he really did kick off the European and really the old world discovery of the New World. But he also imposed, this incredibly oppressive slave regime on the indigenous peoples. And, that was really pretty horrible, actually. And so do you want to be, erecting statues to someone who, with this, an admittedly mixed legacy that includes really some really terrible acts? So I think that's a reasonable question. And one doesn't need to evoke delusions of harm in order to come down on, well, maybe we should bag this whole Columbus thing. Yes, we should acknowledge that he was an amazing explorer, but do we really need the statue of Columbus here, given his really mixed history? That's not a ridiculous question, and it wouldn't be ridiculous for people to say, maybe we should bag the whole Columbus statue. I don't really know how I think about that, because he was amazing in some ways, but I wouldn't be offended if somebody decided, you know what, maybe we should withdraw the whole Columbus thing.
Well, I go back and forth on it, but I also think of like the roots of the words memorial and monument and what have you are just simply memory. And memory can be good or
Yeah.
bad. So that's why I'm partially, maybe you might not construct anything new, but I wouldn't tear down what already exists.
Well, there's tear down, but there's ways to do memory also,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
When we were, so in July, I was invited to a conference in Hungary on the psychology of tribalism. And my wife, Lisa, came with me, and we spent a couple of days in Budapest, and then the conference was outside Budapest. But we discovered, we'd been to Budapest before and had never done this. There's sort of an outdoor museum on the outskirts of Budapest. I think it's within the city limits, but not by very much, called, of all things, Memento Park, which may be a memory-related Hungarian word. I'm not really sure. Like, you think of a memento as like a souvenir, as something positive, but what this was it was an outdoor museum of statues. It was all statues from the Soviet era, from the Iron Curtain era. And it was a testament to the sort of horrors and oppressiveness of Soviet-style communism in Hungary, before the Berlin Wall fell. And it opens up with this gigantic statue, which is now called Stalin's Boots. It is called Stalin's Boots because it is this immense statue of boots. The boots are way taller than I am, and maybe they're 20, 30 feet high, which is all that's left of an immense Stalin statue. So there was this immense Stalin statue, maybe it was 100 feet high. I mean, I don't know the number, but the boots are like 20 feet high. So you can imagine the rest of the statue.
Damn.
But when the Berlin, after the Berlin Wall, they tore it down, and all that's left is the boots. And the boots are the first thing that greet you when you go to Memento Park, which then includes all these other, Soviet era statues, and there's like written commentary about the history and the origin and kind of the artistic things going on. We actually hired a local guide who was really interesting, who gave a whole depth of sort of richness to what was going on there. So it was great, but it's a park. So the statues were kept. They're now available more or less permanently, but they're not on display. You don't have a giant statue of Stalin in downtown Budapest now. So.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But and like in a similar vein to the Columbus thing, like most of us pretty much revere Franklin Roosevelt for his part in World War II and all that kind of thing. But like I go back also to my grandparents. My grandparents hated him, actually. But it was precisely because like a lot of Estonians didn't really want to be part of the Soviet Union. They were sort of forcibly taken by Stalin in 1940. And it was but it was also one of those interesting decisions of history where Roosevelt and Churchill really did need Stalin's help to stop Hitler at the time. And so one of the agreements they made basically recognized Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania as part of the Soviet Union, which Estonians really didn't want. So that's why my grandparents hated Roosevelt for doing that, for basically being a sellout. But at the same time, well, would it have worked out for us to stop Hitler without Stalin's help at the time? So it's the interesting nuances of history. And just to make that point, but it's something I seem to note, like activists in academia, in particular in the social justice vein, seem to ignore some of those nuances of history as we get into. It's not a truth-seeking thing; it's a
absolutely
activism thing. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean this kind of thing, real politic here occurs throughout history. So you know, this is nothing. Oh, are you still there? Oh, there you go.
I'm
Yeah,
hopefully
yeah,
back.
yeah. No, okay. So it's very easy to dismiss and denigrate the American founding because it, legitimized slavery and included the slave South, and it's embedded in the Constitution, right? But the great, and that's terrible. That was terrible.
It
That's
was absolutely
that
terrible.
that
Yeah.
that was embedded into the legal system. However, slavery was common throughout most of the world at that point. That's number one. And then number two, that does that does nothing to reduce the amazing accomplishment of breaking with hereditary aristocracy.
Yeah.
That was what was truly politically revolutionary about the American Revolution. Now, that doesn't deny that it legitimized slavery, which has reverberated to this very day. So but you can hold these two things at the same, just like you can believe Columbus was amazing and yet, kind of did these horrible things. The founding was kind of amazing, yet included some like really pretty horrible things.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but that kind of social pressure to be on one side is
Yeah.
distortion, not just in just general things, but also in academic literature. And sorry, Kieran, I know you're still under the king over there. I always have to dig him because he doesn't particularly appreciate the monarchy in the UK, but he's still over there in the UK. So
Yeah. Yeah, well, the more dysfunctional the United States gets, the same guy, the guy who escaped from Hungary in a car. This is Joe Forgas, who you may know of from my Substack. He's done a bunch
oh
of
yeah,
guest
yeah, yeah.
posts on the Substack. He has periodically said, really, the United States would be much better off if it brought itself back under the UK. And there are times when I think he's right.
I don't know about that, but but I can't say I disagree with the increasing dysfunction of the United States.
Yeah. Yep.
But so yeah, so we got social pressure in academia and the whole like there.
Yeah, well, this article that you have posted up, this sort of goes through some of that. It's called "Unequal Treatment Under the Flaw" because what I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. I'm going to say Savalainen, but I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name. What he walks through is basically how articles that ruffle progressive feathers are far more likely to sort of evoke denunciation in mobs and then ultimately be retracted than are methodologically and even results-wise identical articles. He has one case that is basically identical, that is sort of surrounded by social justice speak.
Right.
And so as long as you tip your hat to social justice, no matter what you find, you're going to be okay. But if you just present the result as the result and it ruffles the far left feathers, you're going to you're at heightened risk of running into like mobs and then getting your paper retracted. And it's called unequal treatment under the flaw because all social science is flawed. If you want to argue that something should be retracted because of a flaw, you always can do that. But really, if the flaw justifies retraction, then it's going to justify retraction probably of a zillion other articles as well, and not just the one that you're targeting. And that's kind of the point here.
Oh yeah. But it's still. I mean, part of me is just like, well, if they're all flawed, should they all be retracted? Is probably. I'm a little bit more of an absolutist. It's just like in that sense, it's like if you screw up your analysis, yeah, you shouldn't have it published.
Well, there's flaws in this whole flow. I mean, this is not the case with the Savalainen stuff that he reviews. But a common flaw in the social sciences is people making implicitly causal claims on the basis of correlational data.
I saw
You see
that.
this all the time. Now, they're smart enough to not say this causes that, but they'll talk about impacts, influence, increases, decreases, reduces. Now, those are all causal words, that you really are not justified in using, no matter how sophisticated your statistics, unless you have a true experiment, which usually they don't have. So So that's a flaw. Should they be retracted? I don't think they should be retracted. I mean, it should have been caught in peer review. That's a dysfunction that it's not. It should be criticized post peer review. That's fair, completely fair game. I don't think, there's the Committee on Publication Ethics. That is the only a priori professional identification of justifications for retractions that I've ever seen. Now, it's not binding on anybody. You have to agree to be bound by them. But they're excellent guidelines, and I think they should be adopted. And they're appropriate. The principles are appropriate to apply, whether or not journals use them. And they're for data. Inferring cause from correlation is not on the list. What's on the list is fraud.
Yeah.
Or rampant error. So, sometimes it's probably fraud, but you don't catch somebody red-handed. But there's so many known errors in the data that the whole thing is corrupt and should be retracted. With certain kinds of, especially natural science research, they use images, sort of electrographic images or really physical images. You have image duplication, where it's supposed to be different things, but you look at it, it's actually like a slightly different version of the exact same thing. There's a person on Twitter, X now, I guess, Elizabeth Bick, like her whole thing is identifying image duplication in scientific literature. She's very, very good at it. And those would justify retraction. There are other ethical things such as plagiarism would justify retraction, or not having IRB approval, and but those inferring cause from correlation is not one, and outraging a Twitter mob is not one either. So I like their
one, but folks are scared of. I think even editors are scared of Twitter mobs nowadays, which is not a good thing.
One of the really cool things about being serially denounced is that, at least for me, they realize people have run into these mobs and they've been fired. So far for me, it's like, just kind of wipe off the mud and keep going. And, it's really working for me. So I've really been serially down. Not the one you know about is Perspectives, but I was denounced within my own department once. I attended 2 different conferences the conferences were denounced, and actually I was quasi denounced with an email by one of the faculty in anthropology, like a week after I was named chair. And it's like, I'm still here, I'm still chair. It's like, it's like, we're good, right? It's like, you can deal with this. So here are some of the great, these are just delicious, Sophia. They're just so delicious. When there was an issue selecting a chair for anthropology from within the department. Yeah. I don't need to go into all those details. I'm not going to go into all those, but there was an issue. That's when the deans came to me. And my first reaction is, what are you, nuts? And they kind of explained the situation. They urged me to think about it. And I had a series of discussions with them. And somewhere in there, maybe it was the first one, maybe it was the second one, one of the reasons they wanted me to do it is they knew it would be difficult, but they also knew that I was very good at handling hostile, attacks and criticism. And that I would just, be usually reasonably gracious, or just sort of move on or whatever.
Yep.
And it is very amusing to me and ironic that is part of what they saw as a strength that would make me appropriate for the position. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, they needed a chair. So I engaged in some so I'm not going to engage in some misinformation, and then I'll explain the truth behind it. So this is literally true. This coming year, my salary is double what it was last year.
Dang.
Yeah, it's double. But now they didn't double it just because of the anthropology thing. So when I was on sabbatical, so it's 80% to start with, right? So it's a lower, so that's why it's literally true, but it's kind of they didn't double my salary to do anthropology. We have a new contract, so there were across the board raises, so that was kind of in the mix also. And then I got a raise, a permanent raise, and there are temporary raises that normally come with chairing a department because you go from a 9-month to a 12-month appointment.
Sure.
So when you put all that together, it is literally true that my salary is actually doubled from last year. But given that one of the purposes of the mob is to ostracize you, is to make you person non grata, right? Is to just put you beyond the pale. It's like I don't we can't run the experiment, but it feels like, if anything, it's been exactly the opposite. So you have that, and then since the mob, I've had 2 papers come out with a combined total of like 45 authors.
Nice.
Right? There's the merit paper, which you know about, and then there's the persuasive communications, which we just talked about. So there's like, I don't know, 17 or 18 on one and 25 or 6 on the other, so something like that. So, if the idea was to, make me, kind of beyond the pale in some way, they've completely failed, completely and utterly failed. So, and that is just so delicious. It is just so delicious.
That's a nice way. It's a nice way to fail. It's just like you were trying as your activist self to get rid of somebody you don't like, and it didn't seem to work.
Just, they threw a little mud, got a couple of tomatoes, just sort of clean off, threw the clothes in the laundry, and I'm back in business.
Oh goodness! So I mean, a lot of the kind of things that you talked about with in the talk with the biases and social pressure and what have you, it all seems to me like an extension of, frankly, just confirmation bias. You just kind of want it to be whatever you think it should be. But the social pressure side is trying to make everybody else think it should be that too, which is not healthy for science as a whole.
It's really not. It's really not. This is one of the points that Gambrill makes in her scholarship on propaganda, is that one of the hallmarks of flawed scientific literature is the censorship stuff. Because you wouldn't need to censor something if it's just wrong. You would just reveal it to be wrong and you move along. It's when you prohibit something, why would you do that unless you're afraid it might be right?
Yeah, definitely. And it was just coming up to the concluding remarks in your talk. It's just like a lot of these things. And as a proper scientist, you have your limitations to everything in here, which is great.
Yes. Yeah. I have to admit, my favorite of these is the old wine. So let me explain that. So my point in identifying this is that my entire talk could be viewed as nothing but my contribution to organized skepticism. Mm-hmm. Organized skepticism is supposed to be one of the norms of science. Merton in the 1940s argued, was kind of trying to lay out, well, why does science deserve a special place in society's like credibility pecking order? Why should we believe science more than we believe clergy or politicians, or your high school teacher, or why does it deserve this? And one of the reasons, his main reasons, were these norms of science. One of them is organized skepticism. Organized skepticism is not just one person acting like a skeptic. It's that the community of scholars, when it's faced with some new data, new discovery, they really hammer at it to see if they can destroy it, to see if it's really true, to see if it's not true, to figure out if there are alternative explanations that are more true. And in some ways, everything I did in this talk, and really in our conversation, there's nothing, maybe it sounds new, but it's not really new. This is really what organized skepticism is supposed to be like.
Oh yeah. And it should be, but this is where I come back to my concerns over, like, one of the reasons for me doing this channel and pushing as hard as I do is that I do get concerned about the future of science, and that a lot of these kinds of things are not taught to my generation and younger. It's like I said to Anna, a lot of the things, like what the normative principles of science are, didn't learn until 5 years after getting my PhD. So
right, yes.
I was like, what the hell? Why didn't I learn this in grad school? Why wasn't there any requirement I was supposed to take?
First place, nobody learns the principles of science in high school, as far as I know. Maybe somebody does, but
I don't know that either. And I've asked folks.
You learn the facts. You learn, you learn right the chemical compounds and reactions, and you learn some of the principles of things, but you don't learn how anyone discovered any of that. You don't learn how people figured that stuff out. You didn't learn how to cope with uncertainty to reach logically tractable conclusions. Almost nobody does that. So my adult daughter, who has 2 kids, is homeschooling them. And homeschooling them. Now, homeschooling is not what most people think. It's not like, they sit in their house for 6 hours a day, like doing, workbooks. They go out into the world. There are classes that she's in art classes. She goes to forest school where they go out, and the forest school is amazing because they integrate math and science and creativity into being out into the outdoors. It's completely amazing. And so my granddaughter is 7, and she discovered some weird looking rock while wandering around in some local stream. And she is now basically doing some combination of archaeology and anthropology, trying to figure out what made this rock.
Sweet.
That is science. It's at least proto-science. And you want forest school? What kind of public school does forest school? Has kids wandering, getting themselves wet and muddy in streams. So, the difference between those two is stark. So.
Oh yeah, there's dramatic difference. And I mean, but so many do go to public school and a private school and what have you, that even not getting that kind of proto science, there has to be something else that fills the void. And it's just like some of the activism side of it has been like, I don't know if you remember the Smithsonian piece where they assumed the aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture and what have you.
Oh yeah,
scientific thinking, rational thinking, logical thinking is all looped in there as being that, and that's just a way to denigrate everything.
And right, yeah.
But that's my concern, is like what my generation and younger in students are being taught is, well, science isn't all that great because it's just this thing that's been, created by old white guys.
Right. Yeah, which is just so completely. I mean, it's not. Almost all of these things. Okay, so let's retreat way up. The most bizarre conspiracy theories usually have grains of truth under them. So, like the most bizarre current conspiracy to me is QAnon, right? That there's like powerful pedophiles are sitting around, trying to rule the world. This is like completely batshit stuff. And yet, there are powerful pedophiles who have done some terrible things. There's Epstein is obvious. The Catholic priests are another example. So if you have a really bizarre conspiracy theory and you can admit that there are grains of truth under it, even though the whole thing is completely batshit nuts, that's how I see this sort of like science is white supremacy stuff. That it's basically batshit nuts. But there are grains of truth on it, right? There have been times when science has been used for terrible purposes to legitimate, social hierarchies. That's not completely false. It's useful to know about that. So you don't throw the whole thing out because of that.
Yeah, you don't throw the whole thing out. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because. I mean, there's shit floating around the bathwater.
Yeah, you kind of flush the shit down, you clean it up, and you take a bath. That's what you do, right? Exactly.
That's a euphemism I never thought I'd say.
Yeah. Listen, we had that not in this house, but in my first house, which was sort of an old house. At one point, the sewage started backing up into the bathroom. And it was horrible. It was really horrible. But eventually they cleaned it up, and we cleaned it up, and we continued to use the bathroom. So it's like, you do what you got to do.
But yeah, that's where I get worried, is like, I've heard this amongst my colleagues who are younger than I am. It's just like, well, we're doing activism anyway, so it's okay if we embed it in our science. And like, that's not okay, really, is the problem. Yeah. And you guys addressed it so well in the defensive merit paper. It was just like, yeah, we do have our political biases, but that's not a good excuse to just embed activism in everything.
Right. Yeah. We, there's two ways. I mean, everything is always more nuanced than there's two ways to do it. But but it's useful to lay out these two different ways of handling the acknowledgement that we all have our biases, especially our political biases. One is to say, and I think this is how much of academia is going now, my biases are the right one. Everyone's biased, so I'm going to inflict my biases on everything that I do because they're not even biases. I'm just right. That's one way to do. And the other way to do it is to recognize that we all have our biases and to work as hard as possible to limit their influence on the way one conducts one's science and the conclusions one reaches on it. And there are lots of things you can do to limit. You may never be perfect at completely preventing that, but the effort to just as most of us are not perfect drivers. Some of us have gotten tickets. Some of us have even had accidents. And that's probably most people have had either tickets or
some
accidents.
of them have figured out how to get
That's
out
not
of
liberation to just completely ignore all the laws. Well, everybody screws up sometimes. So yeah, just go through the red lights. Just go 35 miles an hour over the speed limit because everybody breaks. No. That is like a ridiculous conclusion that one should reach when one recognizes that everybody occasionally drives badly. The conclusion you should reach is that driving well is worth the effort so that we kill fewer people while driving. That metaphor may be imperfect, but that is very much how I see political biases. Yes, we're all biased, it creeps into the literature, but the effort to limit it is completely worth it, and it's part of being a serious professional scientist.
Exactly. You want to limit it because you want to get at the truth, and this is the other thing for the organized skepticism is like you hope somebody with a different bias actually reveals something that went wrong on their own, and you actually get at the truth. And it's just like, that's the hope of that, but that's not allowed in an activist kind of.
Well, yeah, right. Well, because if you're coming from an activist perspective, you already know the answer, and so what your goal is to impose the answer on pretty much everybody else. So you don't want debate and discussion.
No, I mean that would reveal that I'm wrong, or would
yes,
or
and that
as it
everything is
often seems to
misguided.
be. It's like it seems to be, particularly with the postmodernist activists, it seems to be more about power than anything else, which is just not
well. They're sort of following their own reading of the way things work, right? I mean, one of the points of the postmodern social constructionist critical theory thing is that many social phenomena, maybe in some cases all of social phenomena, are really just thinly veiled manifestations of power, hegemony, and status, right? And so if you believe that the entire game is power and status and prestige, that's the whole game. Well, then you're going to do a playbook where all that matters is power.
Yeah,
So because that is, from your perspective, that is all that matters. It's just now we're going to have different people playing the game, and we'll have different people on top. That's the idea.
Which is just wild and all sorts of. Because I think of how the activist mindset sort of drips out. If it gets embedded in academia, then it eventually drips out because it's part of the culture, and we're teaching new students and all those kinds of things. And admittedly, this is not to say this happens to everybody, but I think of what unfortunately happened to Richard Bilkstow in Canada. It's a very recent thing.
I'm not sure I know the story.
So Richard Bilkstow was a principal in the Toronto District School Boards in Canada, one of the school principals there. But they decided to bring in a DEI training group of Kojo Institute to do DEI trainings with everybody and what have you. And he ever so politely challenged the assertion that Canada is more white supremacist than the United States because we still worship the king or something like that. And those kinds of things. He challenged that because he's taught in the US and he taught in Canada, and he challenged it from his opinion. And the founder was actually doing the training. So she actually, Kiki Ojo Thompson is her name, but she didn't accept his findings. She basically slandered him and defamed him right there on the spot. But in subsequent sessions, she encouraged the other participants to pile on him, not by naming him. He was called a weed. He was called the whiteness and all this other kind of stuff. And it resulted in about the actual incident was in 2021, but it resulted in 2 years of shaming and defamation. And he lost his
Wow.
reputation and all this other kind of stuff. And then unfortunately, the reason it made it back into the news recently, the Free Press actually got hold of all the audio from these things because it was done over Zoom and published them. And I listened to the audio. It was horrific. But he just couldn't take it anymore, and he actually committed suicide last month.
Oh yeah, that's that story. No, yeah, that right. Yeah, okay.
That's what I get concerned about. Is like you embed activism, you have so much pressure, you can't say it. You're an evil part. You're gaslit into being an evil
Yeah.
person, which is why I find your case remarkable because you're just like, yeah, whatever. And that is an attitude that is needed at this point.
Yeah.
But it is terrible because I do think I think the audio is very damning that she basically caused the pylon that destroyed his life.
Wow.
I believe they're under investigation by the ministries of Canada right now. So I think the
Wow.
education ministry in particular, but it was horrific. But that's of course like the worst of the worst that could happen to somebody
Yeah.
when they cross a mob. But even just so politely as he did, because it's like it's a very mild criticism he had. He didn't
Yeah.
to the nth degree with it.
Well, the irony, well, you know, the Yoel Inbar story. I mean, it's not quite as severe. Basically,
Yeah.
lost out of job. You know what looks like because he questioned the way DEI, the value of DEI statements. He wasn't even talking about DEI in general. It was just a very specific component of DEI, and which is probably right about. The statements are really almost completely useless. The trainings are also pretty much worthless. I mean, there's been a series of papers by people kind of supportive of social justice efforts generally. I mean, this is not like by people like me who think the whole thing tends to be nonsense. It's really the kind of advocates saying, well, you know, the trainings are pretty ineffective.
Oh yeah. I've seen that. I like Musa Al-Garbi did a good one for real.
Oh yeah, well, he's great in general.
Yeah. But it's just it's just horrific because it's like I know my concern in the long term is for science as a whole, in that the more actually different perspectives are just shunted out by an increasing amount of activism, well, then you really can't be getting at what the truth is anymore. And I think about then all the things that up until this point, science, for all its flaws, has provided a lot of really good things, whether it be treatments for cancer or getting to the moon or any number of other different things, amazing things in history. And I just worry that there's going to be a lot of things that end up being produced that are bad for society because there isn't the challenge to the bias and there's more activists and what have you. And seeing what's happened with social sciences now filter into STEM disciplines is scary as hell.
It is. You know, it probably hasn't. I'm hesitating because I'm not sure about this. My best guess is that it hasn't affected the conduct of the natural sciences much, if at all. It you know, when you have natural science outlets publishing nonsense social science, like, you know, whiteness and physics or whatever the hell, math or whatever the hell that was. I mean, that's basically social science. It's being published in a physics outlet, but it's social science. It's not. They're not. You know, they're not discovering a new biochemical process. You know, they haven't created a more you know, a stronger ceramic or something like that. You know, they haven't discovered life. They haven't discovered a new exoplanet that's Earth-like and might be harboring life. You know, that's not what they're doing. They're like sort of grandstanding in this political way about, you know, racism and prejudice and oppression in physics or in geology or wherever the hell they're doing it. So it's fundamentally social science. That stuff is completely corrupt, in my opinion. But it's not the conduct of the natural science. It's not the products of natural science yet. So Those are different. They are different. That gives me, I don't know if that gives me more, it gives me less reason for pessimism yet. Let's put it that way. It doesn't really give me a reason for optimism, but it's just if the fortress is still standing despite being kind of under attack, well, it's better than if it's not still standing.
Yeah, that's true. But actually, John here had a good comment here in that, you know, the only defense against the truth actually is obfuscation, which is a fair point. Actually, I mean,
well, that's actually one of the things we talked about in the persuasive communications paper, that sort of overly complex language and hiding flaws in this way. So he's absolutely right about that.
Yeah, definitely. But well, I'm optimistic that STEM professionals have been pushing back against some of the crazier things that have come up in the last few years.
Yeah.
Although I'm less optimistic when I see things like in Nature Chemistry, of all the bloody places, an article saying, "Oh, well, critical race theory is really important to have in chemistry." I'm just like, "Oh dear Lord, that's not good."
Yeah, I didn't see that one. Would you either email me or post me that link, or put it in the chat or whatever? Yeah, I didn't see that one.
Let me see if I can.
I mean, I've seen stuff. Nature has done a whole series on decolonization, and so I'm not surprised, but I just didn't see it.
Yeah, let me see if I can't find it real quick.
I'll share it. There's so much like this; it's impossible to keep up.
Oh yeah, here it is. There it is. Oh my gosh.
I think it's Lily
behind a firewall here, so I can't show the whole thing, but but it's let me stop that. The only thing that's fun is you can't switch from PowerPoint to browser very easily with with this. So yeah, this was the thing that got me.
Wow. No, I totally didn't see that. I'll have to track that down.
Yeah, no, I mean, I got behind the paywall a while back, and I know I had the PDF somewhere, but it's just it was wild. And what drove me crazy, actually, and another colleague in the heterodox STEM group actually made this point, is that you could cut out parts of this and actually put it into a different discipline journal, and it would still say the same thing.
It would say the same
relevant
thing.
for climate, relevant for physics. All this other. You could do that very easily. But yeah, it's pretty wild. I was unhappy to see this. I know a few others were just like,
well, I mean, I was thinking about this just today. For especially white liberals, which are lots of academics who have on the editorial boards and stuff. All you need to do is say George Floyd, and then any anti-racist thing you say after that, they're going to believe. That's it, George Floyd. Oh yes, I must believe that that white people are conspiring to to keep their to keep themselves on top of everything, even though there's abundant evidence that white people don't get the most degrees, they don't have the high. No, they're on the top because of George Floyd. George Floyd.
Yeah, no, and I mean, in the same vein, like there was always the pervasive sexism in academia category and what have you. And I as I said this to Anna, I've said it publicly and privately to many folks at this time. I have been in climate science for all of my career, and meteorology and statistics, and before that, and just like never ever did I have to deal with sexism as a problem until I had to deal with DEI folks who have their heads so far up their own asses that they didn't realize what they were saying to me was actually really sexist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think historically, academia did have a sexism problem. I think
no, I'm not denying
it. If you talk about older faculty, it sounds like it was pretty real, at least in some places. It's probably real in some places still, but the balance seems to have shifted. Actually, my sense is that now anti-male biases are stronger than anti-female biases. That they're still traditional sexist.
And I think there was a Nobel laureate that got in trouble for saying that.
Yeah. I mean, I listen. What are they going to do? Denounce me? I mean, I'll just go back to
that. John has another kind of point, and yeah, I've seen that too. It's just like this goes to the 500 articles that all say the same wrong thing.
Yeah, it does.
But
yeah, I mean, Cece and Williams have been all over this, and long before Christina Hoff Sommers was all over it. So.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And it really, this has been a change. I mean, 20 years ago, this would have looked like men being defensive and kind of protecting their ability to engage in sexless ways. But I really think it's flipped. I mean, it's not like flipped gigantically, although sometimes in some places maybe it is. But it's flipped. I think it's flipped, at least in academia. I don't know about the wider society. I don't know enough about the wider society to have a strong opinion. But within academia, I think the weight has flipped.
Oh yeah, and it's changed a lot. Like, and no, I don't disagree. It's like my supervisors have had very different experiences from me in academia and have had to put up with some of the crap in their lifetime. But they're also a lot older than I am. It's just like my supervisor is twice my age, so it's one of those things for sure. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things, of course, in that many different papers and what have you now have many different papers and surveys have pointed out the bias and the culture on campus is not necessarily the most friendly thing in the world for particularly diverse viewpoints. And I've been honest in saying this on this channel before, and that I am actually politically much more conservative than I am liberal, which is walking contradiction for most people to think about when you're a climate scientist at the same time. So it's it's been interesting for me that way. I've always gotten more flack for having conservative views from academics than I have ever had from conservatives for being a climate scientist. That has remained true to this day, and it's been interesting. But I noticed you were involved recently in the Princeton principles,
yes,
and the development of that, and always liking to get into a positive note. I figured that's a good way to go. Is good way
that
to go.
Was a great experience. Who knows whether it's going to have legs or have any impact, but you throw stuff on the wall and you hope that something sticks. You accept that most of it's not going to stick, but every once in a while something sticks, so
throw the spaghetti at the wall.
Yep.
Go put this up here. Have some fun with that. And so what prompted everybody to get together with this? Was it the concern about activism in academia, or was it something just a little more general? Or
well, okay, so it was convened by a couple of really senior faculty active in academic freedom things at Princeton. So Robbie George, who's this famous law politics, I think he's founder of the Madison Center there. And then I think one of the organizers was Keith Whittington, who's one of the main founders of the Academic Freedom Alliance. And I think what I suspect, I don't know this, but what I suspect is what motivated them. One, they're paying attention to the wider cultural developments, and you have this rise of censoriousness within academia. But I think the specific catalyst was this Princeton letter from about 2 or 3 years ago. I don't remember whether that letter had a trigger. It might have. But hundreds of faculty, grad students, and alumni signed a letter calling on the Princeton University administration to energize a slew of anti-racist practices and policies. And some of it was not ridiculous. I mean, it was like, whatever, just programs for diverse faculty or something like that. But one of the things that, again, hundreds of people signed on to this, Princeton community people, Princeton, faculty, graduate students, and alumni, was a call to create an oversight committee to ensure that nothing racist ever escapes Princeton, that nothing racist gets published in peer review, nothing racist gets published in any books, racist grants aren't funded, racist talks aren't given.
Oh, given some postmodernist theories, that goes down a rabbit
Yeah, that
trail
would
real fast.
be almost any. Yeah, I mean, if I wanted to do exactly, if I wanted to do a critique of growth mindset, that could be viewed as racist, right? So, um, so this was really Orwellian. It was viewed outside of those promoting it and signing on. It was widely criticized as this Orwellian development within Princeton. Um, Now, the administration never acted on most of it. Maybe they never acted on any of it. They certainly didn't create a committee to ensure nothing racist escapes Princeton. But I think that event scared the shit out of a bunch of Princeton faculty. That they kind of saw what that meant.
Yeah.
That people in their immediate environment are ready, willing, and able to inflict their values on other people in a way that would really be indistinguishable from outright censorship. So I suspect that's what motivated this. That this, that they wanted to create the goal was to create a more robust version of the Chicago principles. So for people who might be listening, don't know, the University of Chicago adopted around 9 years ago, this sort of bedrock commitment to free speech and academic freedom. But they believed, and I think correctly, that times change and move on, and those are good. They're sort of a good starting point or foundation stone, but they're not the full edifice. And they really tried to I was part of the group, tried to expand on and provide a sort of more robust set of principles defending free speech and academic freedom. So that's sort of where that came from.
Yeah, and it's interesting the like some of the language that you all have here with the fiduciary duty of it to foster freedom of thought, which I think is the first time I've seen that specific language show up in one of these kinds of principle documents.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is going to be an unnatural concept to especially my younger colleagues, because they don't think about this stuff. And
no, I mean, they've been brought up to think that you cause harm to somebody, therefore you shouldn't be allowed to say it, which is
right. Well, and that goes a little far, but they definitely have thought a lot about social justice issues, and almost not at all about academic freedom. And I don't know how they would, if when compelled to think about it, I'm really thinking about my direct colleagues at Rutgers.
Right.
I'm not. I think if compelled to think about, most of them would be okay. I think actually, but they're not compelled to think about it. It doesn't come up, and so it's very Millian. John Stuart Mill, in arguing for sort of unfettered exchange of protections for discourse, included the idea, well, what do you do when some belief is wrong? Like, why should you permit a wrong belief into discourse? It's wrong. We all know it's wrong. And he had several reasons. One, you can never really know that it's wrong, and even if you do know that it's wrong, it may have grains of truth, kind of like our QAnon and white supremacy discussion that we had earlier. So it's worth engaging to extract the small pieces of truth, even if it's mostly false. But one of them, even if it's complete, and this is actually my favorite, and it's directly relevant to this academic freedom conversation we're having now, even if it is actually completely 100% wrong, unless one has the experience of having to defend the true belief against a determined and kind of thoughtful attack that is wrong, one will forget why and how to justify the true belief. Those skills atrophy. And so what you can get then is a wave of mis and disinformation, of falsehoods that sort of have maybe a prima facie plausibility that are false, that no one has the skills left to protect against.
Mm.
So, and that's what I really do think is the state of academia. It's not that people exactly oppose it; they don't think about it, and that muscle has not been worked, and because it hasn't been worked, it
Right.
hasn't been strengthened, and it is now very weak. And
Mm.
that I think is true.
Okay, yeah, I could see that. And then also just, well, also never having the opportunity to work that to begin with, if you
Right.
really just were never taught in the young. Well, we're
The,
never presented with that idea. Really, I don't want to say never been taught, but never been presented with that idea in the course of your study. Um, so it's like the way my position is, I'm not ever likely to have graduate students myself, but it's one of those things that I would bring up is that would bring up if I had graduate students is actually have this kind of a discussion with them. It's just like not necessarily a right or wrong answer to it, but in here, but you need to be thinking about it because I think one thing that's prompted folks to think about academic freedom more has been the situation, rightly or wrongly, whatever your opinion is on the subject, of state legislators now getting involved and trying to say you shouldn't teach this and you shouldn't teach that.
well, that's a whole.
I
There's
mean,
two different
that's a
issues.
whole other thing, but that's where people have been somewhat prompted to think about the academic
Yeah.
freedom thing. Is now all these people are like, wait a second, you shouldn't teach that.
Right. So there's a partisan way to approach that, and there's a principled way to approach that.
Yeah,
And I suspect most of what is going on is partisan. So, conservatives are saying this stuff, and so, the progressive academics know that conservatives are bad. So pretty much anything conservatives try to do is bad, including this. Now, from a principled standpoint, at least in the United States, state governments should not be in the business of telling faculty what they can and cannot say, teach, or study.
yeah.
So those, to the extent that that's what those laws do with respect to higher education, I'm almost positive they're illegal. And I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so no one who's listening should treat me as an expert on this. But the First Amendment is really clear about the government not being able to limit speech. So that very simple principle, I'm pretty sure those laws are illegal. That's different than the states funding state universities and therefore having a vested interest and the right to influence the direction that those universities go
Mm.
by appointing the president, by appointing the trustees and the, whatever the advisory board is to the university. That is a completely legitimate exercise of government authority over a state university. So I think the speech bans are illegitimate, but the appointing, people who the state, whether it's the legislature or the governor, depending on the state, I think this is done differently, appoints people to run universities the way they believe universities should run. It's completely legitimate exercise of authority. And someone doesn't like that, what they can do is throw them out and elect somebody else into that office.
Mm.
That's how democracy kind of works.
Well, yeah, no, or at least it's supposed to work anyway. At least it's supposed to work. But yeah, no, I bring that up just because that is when I was reading through these, and I did a video on the Princeton principles earlier this week. But when I was reading through this, that was one of the things that came to mind. Just like one of the reasons anybody who's been traditionally left progressive in academia is finally thinking about academic freedom is now they're suddenly confronted with these
Right.
kinds of speech bans and what have you. And whether rightly or wrongly, some of these bans and proposed bans have arisen because of what has become a censorious nature on campus that maybe you're just not so willing to see if you're
Right. Yeah. Well, it's different though when it comes from the government than from the grassroots, right? The censorious culture on campus comes from the grassroots. It comes from students and faculty.
Yeah.
That's different than when it comes from the government. So I completely agree with the U.S., the founders, that it's most dangerous when it comes from the government. That really the government's hands need to be tied because the government is so powerful. So I'm completely on board with that. From the grassroots, it's actually a very difficult issue because it's difficult because free speech and academic freedom can and do conflict.
Yeah.
So free speech absolutely protects your right to denounce and demonize me. The government can't be preventing you from doing that.
Yep.
On the other hand, when you organize a mob to denounce, ostracize, and retract my articles, even though that's legally protected speech, that's now creating this censorious culture within academia that
Right.
is in fact corroding academic freedom. So the solution has to be something, to me, has to be something different than government intervention, which is one of the reasons we created SOIBs. That you introduced this introductory comments. It's meant to be a bastion, a place that is protected from these developments within academia.
Yeah. Yeah, no. And I think one of the reasons I really like, actually, and I hope the Princeton principles actually take off, is because I think properly put in and taught, this is actually a way to correct some of the censorious nature of, that exists on campuses currently. And having been in that some of that situation myself, where it is actually terrifyingly lonely at times, where you're just like, I don't think I can get away with saying something
Yeah.
in this university. But it's that's kind of my hope with it. But I know the point that I made in my video was, I go back to Ben Franklin's famous statement after the Constitution was ratified: "It's a republic if you can keep it."
If you can keep it.
Yeah,
Yep.
and while these kinds of statements like this are great, I guess, and would help against the culture of activism in academia and the censorship that results from that, I wonder how you get it implemented and how you keep it. Let's put it that way. Well, yes, John, you are correct. We will make the point: the United States is a republic, technically.
Well, but I think John. First of all, I like most of John's comments, but I think he's wrong about the democracy. That we are being a republic is not mutually exclusive with being a democracy.
Well, that's true.
The officials are elected by majority vote, with the exception of the president, which is elected via the Electoral College, which is still a form of democratic election, not counting a whole twisted minority thing. So,
well, yes.
So I do think it is a republic, but that doesn't make it not a democracy.
Oh no. I understand what you're saying there. It's a fair comment, but we're not a pure democracy either. Yes,
that is true. That is absolutely true.
Yeah. It's like where everything is governed by absolute consensus.
Well, and John, one of John's points is that mobs are dangerous. I think he's absolutely right about that, like 100% right about that. We're seeing that throughout academia with retraction by outrage mob. It's like, fortunately, they're not, they're not lynching people anymore, right? They're not burning witches at stakes. But that's actually a cultural improvement over, for 100 or 200 or 300 years ago. It's bad, but it's not as bad as it used to be. And I do think the principles underlying, really the democratic founding of the United States and the main constitutional amendments, those principles, even when they don't apply legally, they should apply. They almost always should apply, which is why, we need institutional protections against censorious mobs. The mob has a legal right to, denounce and demonize and call for people to be punished and fired and their paper. They actually absolutely have that legal right, but they shouldn't be permitted to do it. So someone needs to be in a position of authority that says, okay, well, you can say whatever you want, but we don't have to do this, and we're not going to do it.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it here as one of the things that got mentioned in here, which I was really glad to say, was like, we should not be allowing a heckler's veto.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, universities should never be allowing a heckler's veto. Now, if things actually get violent, that's a little different story.
That is a different thing.
Yes. Yeah. Right, just because some, yeah, exactly. Although, this goes both ways. So I'm going to tell you a story that's maybe out of character slightly. Um, Years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, it was pre-COVID, spiked online. There's sort of a UK libertarianish online magazine was doing a tour across the United States called its what was it called? It was called, I forget what it was called. It had some, provocative, sort of like Unsafe Science. It was like unsafe discussions, unsafe issues, or something like that.
Oh yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I can't remember the name either.
And so they wanted to hold one at Rutgers. Somehow they contacted me. I don't even know how they knew I existed then. I wasn't even on Twitter yet, but they knew I existed and they contacted me. And I was sort of I wasn't really heavily involved, but I was sort of the liaison between them and like the Rutgers administration to like reserve a room and like all those like bureaucratic logistics. So I and one of my graduate students went to the event where they had, this was actually one of my first exposures to Sarah Hayter. She was a speaker. Um, there was Camille Foster. He's sort of this rich, very successful Black libertarian business guy.
Is that or is it?
And then there was Mark Lilla, who is a very interesting, kind of left wing, but like old time left, sort of like a Henry Jackson style left. Hard nosed, and let's not deny reality. And the left needs to grapple with like some political realities left. And then there was a fourth guy who I don't remember, but he was like the only conservative student who was just graduating that year at Wellesley or some such place like that.
Oh,
right?
wow.
He was at some way left liberal arts college, and he was very out as a conservative. So it was a great panel, and they talked about all sorts of issues, including policing and imprisonment and all this sort of stuff. Okay, a bunch, I don't know how many, I don't know, 10, 15 Black Lives Matter protesters showed up. And intermittently got raucous. So they would be chanting during or in between speakers. They also participated and sometimes clearly grandstanded and kind of went on too long, like there were limits and stuff. But they didn't shut the event down. The event, proceeded. And an article appeared in Quillette describing the event as your typical, left-wing protesters shutting down an event. And they didn't. And Akila, the grad student who helped me organize it, I did not exactly organize it, helped me with some of the logistics and attended with me, were like, this article does not describe our experience. We were there. That's not what happened. So we wrote a response. And, where we described what happened. And the way we characterized it was they were definitely pretty raucous. There were probably some times where they crossed some lines, but they quickly retreated. They quickly crossed back after having crossed the line. The event continued and continued till the end. And our conclusion was that, this was a form of legitimate dissent. You're allowed to protest the event. You don't have to agree. You can grandstand, you don't have to listen. There's no impetus on you to take seriously any of the arguments.
Yep.
There's nothing saying you can't denounce the speakers. This is part of absolutely legitimate dissent, long as you don't shut down the event.
Yeah.
And stigmatizing legitimate dissent as if it is beyond the pale is actually, in this context, a greater threat to free speech and open discourse than was anything the protesters actually did. Yeah. Because you cannot be in the business of stigmatizing legitimate dissent. Legitimate dissent is kind of what the country is founded on.
Right.
Unsafe spaces. Yes, John, that was it. Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, good. But yeah, no, I'd agree with you. I mean, I might be annoyed by them grandstanding there, but that's legitimate dissent. I have no right to shut that down. Just like,
that's right.
So
exactly.
But yeah, that leads back to the question I was asking, is like, how do you ingrain something like the Princeton principles and bring back that culture of free inquiry? And the more and tougher question is, well, how do you keep it?
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, right. This goes back to your Ben Franklin point, right? It's a republic if you keep it. Those two are connected, right? I mean, the education system, as far as I can tell, much of public education and much of college is so geared around social justice that principles of individual rights, individual universal human rights, whether it's free speech or free religion or free association, that these are legal principles and they're legal protections, but they are also, they, in my opinion, these are general moral principles that apply well, whether you're legally protected or not does not really matter. The principle still, you should live your life as if the principle holds or should hold in many, many other contexts. It's not absolute, nothing is absolute in a context which they wouldn't hold, but certainly in a context like academia, due process, freedom of association, freedom of speech, you want that to hold. You absolutely want that to hold. So how do you get that? You have to teach it. You have to provide people experiences with it. I did the last time I taught a large undergraduate course. I absolutely did this. I had them conduct an internal debate about whether Rutgers should adopt the Chicago principles. So we hadn't done this was years ago, so it wasn't
Yeah.
the principle. And I had them break up into small groups of like 3 or 4 to have an internal discussion and then make a decision. And they had 3 options. They could say, no, Rutgers should not approve this. Yes, just that's it. Rutgers should approve it. Or 3, Rutgers should approve it, but they have some revisions they want to make.
Sure.
So it was like yes, no, or yes with revisions. So they talked. I had them talk among each other for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we voted. When they voted, it was almost a perfect split. Again, they voted as groups, so it's almost like the United States and the states and the Electoral College. They didn't vote as individuals. Each group had to come to a decision, but the group split. Nobody said no. Everyone said yes, but they were split evenly between yes as is or yes with revisions. So, okay, I had people then explain why the group voted as they did. And oh my God, Sophia, it was like a thing of beauty. The first person to speak was this young Black woman who had not spoken much during the class. She gets up, her group voted yes, they should support the Chicago principles without revision. And I wish I had recorded it because I cannot do it the way she did it. She said, the upshot of what she said was something like this. If you protect everyone's freedom of speech, you're going to allow racists to speak, but you are also going to allow people the right to criticize them and expose their racism. And she sat down. That was all she said.
Yeah.
And it was perfect. This was absolutely perfect. Okay, so that was her. And then, so what about the groups that wanted revisions? I was sure, given the sociocultural discourse of the time, there were going to be exceptions for hate speech and harm and all this. No. None of that. Every group that had a revision, you know what they wanted? They wanted the Chicago principles with teeth. That is, if someone violated someone else's right to speech, they should be punished in some way. So if someone was disrupting an event, the student should be punished. It was like, holy shit. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So my point of telling the story is that there is way more support for these fundamental principles, even among young people, when they are compelled to think about it. Yeah, and it doesn't take that much to get them to think. I didn't demand that they think any particular thing. They could have voted any way they wanted. And when they had a chance to talk it out among themselves, it was like a thing of beauty. It was absolutely a thing of beauty. And I don't know this, but I hope that little demonstration created a seed that sprouts as they go on with their adult lives.
What would you think about having more of those demonstrations just happen really regularly?
Yes, things like that, absolutely.
I know John asks a question.
Yeah, but we talked about that. Yes, both Sophie and I. Do you think the recent social movements were means to have social sciences move social sciences to a hard science? And absolutely, the social science ideas are absolutely infecting the hard sciences, the natural
Oh yeah,
sciences.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
and to add to that, I mean, like one of the things that has been quite common in my field lately has been the idea of doing interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary science, where you have regular interactions between physical scientists and social scientists and what have you. So the
yeah,
you do end up seeing a lot of social science ideas move into hard sciences that way too, which is
yeah,
concerning sometimes.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah,
yeah. But the
that's
answer
a
to that
great
is
idea because I would love to see more of those kinds of demonstrations happen. That is such a
yeah.
wonderful story because it's just like, okay, yeah, you can expose this and that, and you can
I
and you
wish
can
I had
actually
recorded it. It's like that. That captured the upshot, but she was very unassuming. She spoke, not super quietly, but kind of quietly, and it was not more than 20 words, and she just sat down, and it was like I was jaw dropping. And I wish I had recorded it. It was exquisite. It was absolutely. That's it. That is the essence of the principle. It's the essence of the principle and why the principle is so important.
oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and that'd be just great to see that replicated. And it's like so much more hope in students after hearing a story like that
Yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah, yes, yeah, exactly. It does. It did that for me also. Actually, it's like what the world looks like it's going to hell in a handbasket, and maybe it is going to hell in a handbasket, but maybe it's not.
Awesome, but so do you think then that the way to keep it once you get the culture of free inquiry and exposing students to that is just to keep doing some demonstrations like that, or is it the teeth that are missing really?
Well,
Because I think that's one of my complaints with the Chicago principles. I saw that too. It's just like, there's not teeth to them to
yeah,
actually
right.
enforce it.
Well, I would definitely support teeth. I mean, if you disrupt an event, you should be punished. Like, I don't know if you should be, suspended or expelled or anything like that, but you should be punished in some way. Like, I'm not sure, like, what if somebody disrupts an on-campus student disrupts to actually disrupt and succeeds at preventing it, suspension for the rest of the semester. Maybe you could do something short of that, but I would absolutely endorse that. It's like come back when you're basically a civilized human being. And if you can't do that, don't come back. So I would support that. Maybe you could do other things short of that. I'm not sure what that would look like. Um,
No, I mean
you know,
that's
if somebody wanted to do a benevolent, like a community service thing, where they have to engage in some sort of service supporting academic freedom and free speech rather than being suspended, if somebody could come up with something constructive along those lines, I think I would support that also.
no. I think I know what happened after the Stanford, after the Judge Duncan and the Stanford case was they instituted a mandatory free speech course, which I
Yeah, right? Yeah, yeah,
don't know how much
yeah.
that's going to work, but I think John's got
Well,
one
that's a
other.
step in the right direction, though. I mean, compared to not having anything like that in a law school, that's absolutely at least a step in the right direction.
Yeah, no, that needs to happen in a law school for sure. I think
Yeah.
John's got. Would social science as a hard science cause the destroying of lives in experiment, though? Which I'm not quite sure what John's getting at, but
Hi, Rob. Nice to see you here. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not quite. Yeah, I mean, I'd be game for constructive forms of punishment, but also, if you're going to repeatedly do it, then
Well, that would be different, but hopefully they wouldn't, right? I mean, you have them do some sort of free speech, academic freedom, open inquiry. Let them work. I'll create an internship at the Journal of Open Inquiry because we certainly need help, and they could spend 6 months kind of working with us on these various issues, and hopefully they'd actually get something out of it as well.
there you go. That's another constructive way to do it. Like, why not do like free and open inquiry internship
Yeah,
and invite
yeah,
students into that? That'd be fun. I can think of a few students that would enjoy that.
yeah. Yep, yep. So
Awesome. Well, we've been going at it for a good 2 hours and 20 minutes and having fun
Yeah,
here.
it's been a long time. It's been a long time. Hopefully, right. The one bad thing about long pods is people will, who has 2 hours to listen to it, right? Like maybe if they're on a road trip and they find you or I particularly, even, we're not that interesting to be 2.5 hours worth. I mean, there are some interesting things here, but
Yeah.
with all that, I can have a big ego and all that sort of stuff, but 2.5 hours is a lot to ask. So.
Well, no, it's one of the things I try to do with these is that I'll clip them out and make the interesting segments into short clips so
Yeah,
it's easier for folks to follow. So,
yeah.
yeah, in connection with his previous question, he was saying, yes, the recording will be available. So, Rob, before I forget, the way it works with YouTube and streaming, it's like a DVR. So YouTube's recording this as we talk. So it'll appear pretty immediately on my YouTube channel right after we close. So John said this was his original question, just as a reminder there, but this was what he did an addendum in connection to social movements trying to make social sciences into hard sciences. I think he's saying, would that destroy lives in an experiment?
That's really hard. I mean, okay. The really bad case scenario would be, the way the social science infection of the natural sciences works is by corroding really merit-based identification of scientists and bringing scientists into the natural sciences. You now have a bunch of incompetent scientists who build bridges that fail and rockets that crash and all sorts of terrible things like that. But that's like a real nightmare scenario that I don't really think that's likely anytime soon. There is. A colleague recently sent me an article that was kind of painting an Atlas Shrugged. It was an essay that painted an Atlas Shrugged type scenario. So an Atlas Shrugged is Ayn Rand's big novel. In my opinion, it's not a very good novel, but it's sort of a bad novel wrapped around a brilliant idea. And the brilliant idea, so I don't recommend anyone read it because it's like 1,200 pages long or something like that, and it's really not worth it. But the brilliant idea is this: that collectivist ideologies take hold in the United States so far that's a little bit prescient. That seems to be kind of happening, at least in some places, and that because collectivist ideologies, are really not interested. There's almost no such thing as individual merit, which we see that in postmodern and social constructionist and critical theory type intellectual approaches now. Merit is just a means, a rhetorical means to power and hegemony. What you end up with are people who are really just not very good at their jobs running the country. And so things begin to fail. Railroads begin to crash. The power grid begins to shut down. And the country's technological and economic progress begins to reverse. Okay, that's the core. That's the sort of the setup. And in response to this, a small group of entrepreneurs, intellectuals, academics, scientists retreat to an enclave deep in the Rocky Mountains somewhere, where because they're all amazingly good at what they do, technology proceeds way faster than in the rest of the society. So they have, I read the book a long, long time ago, so I'm sort of inventing things now, but sort of a protective dome so that they can't be discovered, and it's sort of this libertarian utopia where there really isn't a government. Everybody just does what they want to do. And what they want to do is inherently, kind of for the social good in some way. It's for the community. And so the idea is to create an enclave of competence and progress protected from the deterioration of the wider society. So listen, so I don't think that's really in the process of happening writ large, although it may be happening in places, it is one symptom. I mean, if we start having more railroad crashes and power outages and, then maybe we are moving in a direction like that. This essay argued that there is more of that. I'm not sure whether I believe that. But that core idea, independent of the fact that I'm not crazy about the book, the core idea absolutely is part of what inspired I'm one of the founders of the Society for Open Inquiry. And it absolutely informed that. That is, what we wanted to create is an enclave from this, far left censoriousness within academia.
Right. No, and I can appreciate things like that. Yeah.
Where people wouldn't have to worry about, being denounced if they use wrong speak, where they wouldn't have to worry about their papers being retracted by mobs. I mean, that's, the journal of the society on its homepage says, we will never retract a paper in response to a mob.
Which is awesome right there. And that is a great advertisement just for the journal by itself.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really a shame that you have to see some of those kinds of enclaves develop just because of the way censoriousness is on. And I do get concerned when I see things like with American Medical Association, among others, or there's things where like, yeah, we're going to hire a cancer researcher, but they have to be versed in this kind of social justice stuff. And I'm like, don't you want to answer?
Well, Sally Satel, I don't know if you follow her. Sally Satel has been all over this sort of corruption of psychiatry and medicine. I mean, she's great. She's on Twitter, but she's kind of quiet on Twitter, but she has essays all over the place on this.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. I'll have to look up some of her stuff and do a couple of videos on that. But yeah,
you might want to have her on. She would be a great guest, actually, Sally Satel.
Sure. Yeah, if I can.
She's very kind of charismatic and great to talk to. So.
Cool. Yeah, no, if I can get her contact information, I will look.
Yeah, I can get you in touch with her.
Awesome. Thank you. But yeah, it's that's a lot of what I was looking to talk about, and I think it's been quite loved as a stream, as it were. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts on your mind, or is it?
Yeah, I think we covered pretty much all of it, including my plugs for Joibs and Soibs. So
yeah, definitely. But we got Joibs and Soibs in there. You got Twitter, and of course, Lee is a great follow on Twitter if you want some rabble rousing at the same time as some great academics, because it is a great follow there. And Unsafe Science on Substack is awesome. I follow it and quite frequently looked at stuff, and particularly when the whole Fiedler on the Roof saga was going on.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, because I haven't checked. Have they finally gotten editors back for that?
The last I checked, they had not. Probably last checked about 3 weeks ago.
Oh wow, that's bad.
Yeah, that's bad. I mean, I don't. They probably undermined their own ability to find an editor. Not completely. There are probably some people who would embrace it. And only God knows what they are going to put contending editors through in order to get the job. So even when they have people who might be willing, my guess is the vetting, or what they are going to view as the vetting, is going to be much more intense than it ever was, because they're just not going to want something similar to happen. So
awesome. Yeah. Well, that they did kind of shoot themselves in the foot with that whole.
It was so unnecessary. There was a great Chronicle of all places did a really great article describing it as just an unnecessary controversy, which is exactly right.
I was like, well, that was stupid, because I remember reading your article and I'm like, why would anybody presume?
Yeah, well, I mean, so it is interesting. Roberts, the denouncer, he's obviously steeped in critical theory. So from critical theory, you can do that with anything. I mean, I have one of my essays is I was doing it with anything. You can expose anything as racist. including dog walking and commenting on how beautiful the day is.
That's a video I have on this channel. Is just all these headlines set to music.
Oh, right, that's right. I forgot that you did that. That was great. That was absolutely great. Yes, everyone, you should if you can, put the link up there, because anyone who doesn't know about it who's paying attention, they should watch that, because that thing is exquisite. But Roberts, to his credit, did not sign the open letter.
Really?
Yeah, he never signed it.
I didn't know that. I thought he would have, because the
Yeah, you guys got it. I mean, I have my differences with Robert, and I think the denunciation was ridiculous, which was him. But I gotta, tip my hat on him for not signing the letter.
There we go. That link in the chat.
I mean, if we can admit that Columbus had, if we can admit that Columbus had strengths and weaknesses, we can admit that Roberts had strengths and weaknesses.
Yes, we can admit that. That's true of a lot of people. But yeah, okay. So I think we can wrap up here. Thank you so much, Lee, for coming on. It's been a blast. Like I said, I'll make some clips, and I'll be sharing them around on Twitter and, of course, on locals, for the locals community there. But yeah, this has been fantastic, and come back on again sometime and be
that sounds great.
Fantastic conversation. Until next time, everybody, thank you all so much for watching. If you're watching on the replay, thank you again for watching also. Until next time, we hope you stay curious.
Bye.